Hello and welcome to the Global Dialogue. I'm Shereen Bhan and it is my pleasure to welcome back on the program Borge Brende, the President of the World Economic Forum. He joins us here, not in Davos, but in New Delhi. Borge, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. Thanks very much for your time. Let me start by asking you about your view on the world, and I'll place this in the context of an essay that you wrote for Foreign Affairs. You said in that the world has experienced a gradual slide from cooperation to competition to conflict. In this new and unsettled era, world leaders must adapt their understanding and practice of geopolitics because time is running out to address critical global challenges. Since you wrote that, there have been many other developments on the geopolitical front. Is 2025 looking worse, more unsettling and more uncertain than 2024?
So it is true that we are faced with a geopolitical recession. So the backdrop that we're seeing and moving into in 2025 is very complicated. There's also hope in 2025. We can maybe see an end of the Ukraine war. We can also maybe see that there is no further escalation in the Middle East. And even more importantly is that even with this uncertain geopolitical backdrop and landscape that we're operating in, it hasn't had that negative impact on the global economy. We still believe that there will be 3% growth next year. And of course, this is provided that not any of these conflicts escalate, so it gets out of control. There is competition, of course. You will see increased competition between the so-called G2 next year with China and US, especially after 20th of January, when President Trump will enter the presidency for the second time.
Well, let's talk about, President Trump and his presidency and what that could potentially mean as far as the global economy is concerned. He's already threatened that there are going to be tariffs that will be imposed. There are more export controls that are likely as well. And of course, he's also said that, look, the dollar needs to continue to enjoy the kind of dominance that it does. And that's the message that he sent out to the BRICS. Now, as you look at multilateral institutions, as you look at global trade, what could the implications be of a Trump presidency?
So it's not surprising that President Trump does intend to increase tariffs. That was also his policy in the first term. But what we saw in the first term is that he goes out with this, with, for example, 25% tariff on Mexico. But he says then to Mexico, if you're doing more to stop illegal immigration, and if you're doing more to stop also drugs and narcotics coming over the border, we might then renegotiate this. And I think this is what we will see more of, like deal making related to the tariffs. We also know that the US economy is doing exceptionally well. It is almost growing 3%, and we're also seeing that they are benefiting very much so from the new technologies. The big companies
are all there.
Yeah, and we know from the platform economy that the winner takes it all. Will that be also the case for the Gen AI companies? And he is operating from a view of, from a situation where US is very strong. They're 27% of the global economy with 5% of the global population.
Well, yes, the U.S. economy has continued to be resilient through the Biden presidency and, of course, as we look at what the Trump presidency is potentially going to mean. But, you talked about having some hope that there could potentially be a resolution as far as the Ukraine conflict is concerned. What are you pinning that hope on? Is it on the back of what you believe President Trump is going to be able to do in getting a deal going between Ukraine and Russia? What are you placing that hope on, of a de-escalation or perhaps even a resolution?
Every war has to end, though, sooner or later. It's 3 years, and there's 700,000 Russian soldiers that are killed or wounded. We know that the Russian economy is in a very dire situation. Almost 40% of their economy is now a war economy. They made some gains on the ground lately, but at a high cost. The plan was to take Ukraine in a week. That didn't work out, so it's taking time. So I do think that there might be a window for an understanding for peace next year. Let's see, but that would be very helpful. I also think that the Iran situation is probably easier to handle now because Iran is also relatively weakened because of what has happened with Hezbollah and with Hamas. And also they lost a lot of their anti-air missiles, air defense during the latest attacks. That they had S-300s and there are less of them now. So maybe they also will be more in a negotiating mood because they want to avoid, I think, further restrictions and sanctions from a Trump administration.
Well, we certainly hope that there is a de-escalation and, in fact, a resolution across both of these conflicts. But I also want to get your view on what's happening in Europe, because it really looks like Europe is in a state of disarray at this point in time. We know what's happened in France with the no-confidence motion against the government. Germany facing both its political crises as well as its economic crisis at this point in time. You know, what's the prognosis? What's the outlook as far as Europe is concerned?
Europe is mixed. At the same time as you have quite a slowing of the German economy, and it is the largest economy, you have Spain having the fastest economic growth of any of the OECD countries now. And we're also seeing Greece is coming back, and some European countries are not doing that badly. For example, Poland. I think Germany is going through a structural change because they used to buy cheap Russian gas, export it expensive to China, and that is now changing. And you're also seeing that because of the electricity prices, there are industry moving out of Germany. But I think that Germany has a strong industrial base. And I don't think one should underestimate Germany's way of doing a comeback. Year 2000, they were also the sick man economically of Europe, and it took them 4 or 5 years with reforms, and they came back. Also in democracies, it does happen that there is political turmoil. Difficult now after Barnier got a no confidence vote, so President Macron will need to find a new prime minister and get the budget through. That situation is very complicated. It's almost like an impasse. I would say in Germany there are elections in February, and I think there will come, it will be possible to build a strong coalition after that election that can maybe introduce the necessary reforms. So overall, I'm like on Europe.
You're still optimistic that they will be able to pull together the kind of reforms that are necessary, but what do you believe the comeback remedy could potentially look like? What do you believe is the need of the hour today, specifically when we talk about Germany in the context of Germany making yet another attempt at a comeback?
So we got this report from Draghi a few months ago, and he is a report of 400 pages, where the former head of Italy, but also the European Central Bank, 400 pages where he comes up with all what is needed to increase European competitiveness. I think a lot of those proposals needs to be followed up. It is investment in R&D, it's infrastructure, but it's also getting rid of unnecessary red tape. A lot of suggestions on how Europe can do a comeback. And Europe has shown that in the past, though. For example, in 2012, everyone's speaking about, oh, Greece was bust. And now they're a very competitive economy. 2013, there was this discussion that the euro wasn't a reliable currency. Today, euro is the second most important currency in the world after the US dollars, and 20% of all trade goes through the euro. So one shouldn't underestimate Europe, but Europe has a big job to do. And of course, there are political forces on the right that is causing eruptions in the traditional system. And this is a lot based on immigration topics. As we saw in the American election, I would say there was two eyes. One was inflation, and the second was immigration. And in Europe now, I think immigration and also inflation, and people don't feel that they're better off than they were last year. Quite the contrary.
So given the confluence of some of these factors that you just spoke of, is there an urgency, a sense of urgency to get some of these reforms going and get that competitive edge back?
I think so, because one is also seeing more sluggish growth in Europe than, for example, in the US. Things take more time in the EU because there are so many nations that have to agree. But the strength of the EU is also still that it is 18% of the global economy. It's the largest market in the world. And if you look at life quality and also in age of talentism, where you have to attract talents, I think Europe still has things going for it. But of course, the competition is fierce, and the US is doing very well. And we do see now that companies are moving from Europe to the US, where electricity prices is 1/3, and the economy is booming. But one thing in the US that is challenging is, of course, that wealth is not trickling down. And Trump has also now promised a lot of blue-collar workers that things will get better. But let's look at how complicated things are. One are addressing now this illegal immigration. But if you look at the construction sector in the US, there's 7.5 million people that work in the construction sector. 1.5 million of these are illegal immigrants. So if they don't work in the construction sector anymore, what will happen with inflation? And what will happen with those projects? So it's a complex reality that is also facing the new Congress and the new president.
Well, and often what we see as rhetoric on the campaign trail results in different actions when one is in office, but one will have to wait to see as the Trump presidency kickstarts on the 20th of January. But, you know, you talked about competition, you talked about economic recovery. Let's talk about the view on China as well. It has been a fragile recovery, and it continues to be a fragile recovery at this point in time. What's the view now on where China finds itself, and especially in the context of a Trump administration in the US, what could it potentially mean for China's engagement with the world?
So there will be even more competition between US and China. But they're big. You know, China is 18% of the global economy, US is 27%. So that makes up a big chunk of what is produced globally, what is the global GDP. The competition, I think, is related to technologies. Both knows that the ones that is on top of the technology, Gen AI, will also come out as the most competitive nation. China is, though, facing more economic challenges short-term than the US. There you can talk about the 3 Ds. One is deflation, one is debt, and the third is demography, because they have a sinking workforce now for the first time. So China also needs to go through reforms like Europe is doing. And of course, they also heard from Mr. Trump that they will be facing 10% tariffs on top of all the other tariffs. He also says that that can be negotiable if they can reach a political agreement. But it is also more nuanced than that, because also China has said that they can come up with retaliation. They are, for example, the producer of 90% or 90% of the rare earth comes from China. Many of the most modern batteries with the highest capacity is from China. So I think China is also preparing for a situation like that. So what we need to avoid is a further escalation that leads to a situation with trade wars and decoupling, because that is not in the interest of the global economy.
But you know, it's not just the U.S. Europe has decided to also impose tariffs across a whole bunch of categories. When we talk about China, electric vehicles, just one example, for instance. Do you believe that we're heading into an even more complex global trade scenario as we head into 2025, and that's likely to weigh down on growth rates?
The short answer is yes, but there are alternatives to such a track. Let's first just recognize that 70% of all trade still goes through the WTO, World Trade Organization system. But there is more nearshoring, and there's more friendshoring. You buy stuff from countries where you feel that are your allies.
Right.
Then, on top of this, there is also more of industry policies. So countries say, oh, we want that industry to be established in our country, so you kind of go in and subsidize, incentivize, for example, AI, by R&D, and etc. We are seeing that trade has come back. It was 0.7% growth in 23. This year we expect 3%. So trade growth is almost as high as the global GDP. But what is more interesting is that trade growth is changing so fast. So what is really growing is digital trade and services. Traditional goods are not growing so fast. So those countries that are doing well are those that are stronger in services and digital, including India, where India is really very strong in this area and has gained from this.
Well, you know, since you brought up India, let's talk about what the view is as far as India is concerned. You talked about services, and of course service-led exports for India has been a big engine of growth, and the digital economy as well continues to be something that is fueling growth here, more from an GCC, which is the capability centers that are operating here out of India and supplying talent and services to the rest of the world. What's the view on India at this point in time? What's looking exciting? What's looking good to you?
So what is really exciting is that India is almost becoming the startup nation of the world. So there are 140,000 startups here, and that's the third largest amount in the world. We also have a lot of unicorns, more than 100, and I think there's like a new unicorn every 20th day or something. Why I'm saying this? Because this is the core of what can in the future become the large companies of the world. You know, Google was started in a garage in Silicon Valley. Many of the companies that are most worth, have the highest market cap today, didn't exist 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I'm very optimistic about the entrepreneurial culture and the startup culture in India. I think we underestimated that kind of power, because we are seeing in some other countries there is less of that and more bigger companies inspired by industry policy. So this is a strength. Secondly, it is a strength for India that there is a lot of digital knowledge, and the young population is also something that works for India. We do though see that the growth has slowed a bit. We saw the second quarter numbers this year. There's different explanations there, but overall our economists also believe that growth will go up again a bit in India, provided that there will be reforms. And we still do expect that India will be the fastest growing of the large economies, both this year and next year. And on top of this, we also managed to get in India, you also managed to really start to manufacture goods. And this is something new, and that is a growing sector. And that's also because of the diversification of value chains. Like, who would have thought that Apple was going to build iPhones for $10 billion in India this year, when there was almost none that was produced, manufactured in India just 5 years ago.
You know, so what are you hearing, especially from companies operating in Europe, etc., as they look at diversifying their supply chain? to use India as a manufacturing hub? You gave us the example of Apple, and that's been one of the big success stories. What's the view? Which are the sectors within manufacturing where you believe we are likely to see India play a greater role?
This make in India has a lot of things going for it. And we know that manufacturing in India is lower as part of GDP than in many other emerging economies. You have in India a young workforce, a workforce that also many speak English, and there are skills there. But to do manufacturing, you also have to have good infrastructure, including predictable electricity, competitive energy prices. I think India is benefiting from companies then diversifying their supply chains. There will be companies in the US and Europe saying we cannot manufacture this here in Europe or in the US, but we can set up also plants in India, as we have done in Vietnam previously. So I think that's part of, that's an opportunity for India. I still think, though, that the biggest strength of India is the fact that where the demand is really increasing is on services and digital trade. And there, India has comparative advantage. But, for example, on pharmaceuticals, India is already strong. So that's a form of manufacturing, too. And I think that's a very strong area that is also growing.
Well, you know, you talked about pharmaceuticals. Let me expand on that issue. And what we're seeing today, and, you know, with, again, the Trump administration, question marks on what will happen as far as the WHO is concerned. Overall, what's going to happen with the kind of political turmoil that we're seeing globally at this point in time to development aid? And do you think that there are likely to be even greater setbacks? We've already seen setbacks on many of these social indicators across these social parameters. Do you believe that there's likely to be more significant setbacks on things like development aid, on healthcare spending and healthcare aid, for instance?
So, first, a lot of these are domestic questions in many countries. So they have to also make a priority of education and health. When it comes to traditional ODA development assistance, we are also seeing that many countries that are developed in Europe, including the US, are indebted. So we haven't seen this much debt since 1945 globally. So if you have a big debt burden and you have to cut your budget, it is unfortunately the situation that many countries then also cut and reduce their ODA. That's why the ODA needs to be more catalytic than in the past, and you have to bring in the private sector too. Because if you can then have a combination of governmental sector bringing business in, I think you can do better. For example, on the energy side, there are 700 million people globally that don't have access even to basic electricity. I don't think that can be solved solely by development assistance. You need to have investments too. So we're not doing great when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. By 2030, we're going to eradicate all extreme poverty. We had 17 different goals, and we are around 20%, if you're optimistic, when it comes to be on track on those goals. So there's a delta of 80%, and this means that we're not meeting the targets on education, on water, on sanitation, on fighting poverty, on girls' rights to education. So, and we know on the climate change is still there, and we are not seeing the necessary policy decisions to meet the Paris Protocol. Quite the contrary. We are this year in the hottest year ever.
It's the warmest winter that we've seen in Delhi in the longest time. But, you know, on climate, are you disappointed with the outcomes of COP? Because the developing world, emerging economies are certainly disappointed with the Climate Finance Fund that's been put together.
So in Copenhagen, one agreed on 100 billion a year. It took 10, 15 years to meet that target. I think the agreement now in Baku, Azerbaijan, was 300 billion support every year to developing nations. The problem for many of the developed countries was that there is also a lot of pressure at home.
Yes, the debt that you spoke of. Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of debt, and they say, oh, we should use more on pensions, we should use more on healthcare. And many of these countries, like Germany and France, are also faced with right-wing parties that don't want to spend anything on development assistance. So it's a tricky balance. So I would have liked to see more from Azerbaijan, but at least we got 300 billion. We could also have been in a situation where we only had the 100. But if we're going to get back on track and the planet is not going to end on fire, the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action. So we will need to accelerate the new technologies that can decarbonize the world. And we always look at the cost related to that. But the cost also not doing it is higher, and we can feel it. Agriculture production going down. People cannot live in 50 degrees Celsius. That's
weather disturbances across the world at this point in time, from extreme heat waves to floods and droughts, and we're dealing with all of that in real time. But you know, you talked about technology. Davos 2024 was all about artificial intelligence, and that's what everybody was talking about. What is Davos 2025 going to focus on? What do you believe will be the central theme?
So we've taken that a little bit further, and we're focusing no more on the intelligent age. So there are more than AI. There's also other technologies that will contribute, hopefully, to humankind. But what we really need to crack in Davos is how can we collaborate even in a polarized world? Because there is so much common interest, even if countries are contributing.
What role can the private sector play there?
They can push and they can nudge. Look at, for example, cybercrime. Every year, $2 trillion are lost because of cybercrime. I think both US and China should have in a common interest to fight this. If you look at AI, can increase productivity with 10%, more prosperity. But we also need to agree on some traffic rules, because it's not a good idea that the algorithms control humans. I still think
that the humans need to control the algorithms. Yeah, absolutely.
And we need an algorithm that maybe can control the algorithms to make this into something that is controllable. We also know, for example, on future pandemics, we haven't really agreed on the new rules and how to deal with that. So even in this very complex world, we hope that private sector and countries can come together and say, these are the ways we're going to let others know. These are the measures we're taking to reduce the risk of future pandemics. So we're trying to identify those areas where we still can make progress. So we're very realpolitical.
So I'll end by asking you, who are going to be the big headliners that we should watch out for?
There's going to be 60 head of states and governments there. But of course, we do hope for
the Prime Minister from India.
We do hope for Prime Minister Modi. There are a few years since he was in Davos, and he has clear messages to send. India is the fastest growing of all the large economies in the world. But we will also have great participation from the rest of the world. But we would like to see a real broad footprint from India in January.
Well, look forward to seeing you in Davos, Borge. It's always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us here on the Global Dialogue in India. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the snow.
Absolutely. With that, it is time for us to wrap up this edition of the Global Dialogue. From all of us here on the team for now, goodbye and many thanks for watching.